The archive doors were still sealed when Raja stepped through them, not blown inward, not hanging from torn hinges, sealed, as if someone had welded them shut from the inside, which was precisely what Fleet Lord Kryn had attempted in his final moments of coherence. The tritanium slag in her left hand was still warm from the cutting torch. She did not hurry. 50 years of planning did not require haste in the final 30 seconds. The Zenith processing spire had stopped humming 2 hours ago. Not all at once. That would have alerted the skeleton crew still moving through the lower levels, the ones who did not yet understand that their civilization was already dead. First, the water recirculation in the East Tower had failed. Then the lower auxiliary grid had gone dark. Then very quietly, the fuel pumps that kept Veshari Prime's orbital defense grid online had wound down to nothing. Raja had watched each shutdown register on the feeds from the Iron Ledger, still cloaked 3 kilometers above, transmitting nothing but a soft carrier wave. No chatter, no triumphalism, just numbers on a screen, ticking downward like a countdown that had begun 50 years before any of these systems were even built. The guards outside the archive had not made a sound when they died. Subsonic rounds did that. She had stepped over them without looking down, the way a soldier steps over equipment in a dark corridor. Professional, methodical. The way you move when you have already killed 41 other people in your career, and expect to kill at least one more before the shift ends. Now, standing in Kryn's command chamber, she understood why he had chosen this room as his last stand. The windows looked out over Veshari Prime, a planet that had once glowed with 1,000 cities, each one blazing with the lights of a civilization convinced of its own permanence. Now, from this height, the continents below looked like cooling slag. Vast sections of the planet had already gone dark, power grids failing in cascade, supply lines severed, trade routes closed. The Veshari Dominion was not at war. It was collapsing in real time, visible from orbit, like watching a body decompose at fast forward. "You are human," Kryn said from his grav chair. It was not a question. His voice carried the static hiss of a filtration mask working harder than it was designed to work. "I have been waiting for a human to come. I knew you would. I have known it for 50 years. Raja did not respond immediately. Instead, she surveyed the chamber with the precision of someone conducting an inventory. The desk, vast, dark, made from a wood that no longer grew on Veshari Prime because the forests had been logged 50 years ago to fund the bombardment fleet. The grav chair, a luxury model, worth more than most Veshari families earned in a lifetime, now running on backup power that would fail in approximately 6 hours. The walls covered in ceremonial weapons, mostly decorative, all of them already catalogued in her briefing files as non-functional. She placed the slag upon the empty desk. It left a permanent scratch in the polished alloy surface, a wound that would never heal, a mark that proved something real and irreversible had happened in this sterile space. "I am Commander Rajakal of the Terran Reclamation Fleet," she said finally. Her voice was calm, the way all her voices were calm. She had trained for this moment for 30 years. The voice was part of the training. 50 years ago, your fleet bombed the Jakarta Spire. 47,000 human souls. You did not negotiate. You did not warn. You believed distance meant safety. You believed absolute power meant absolute security. You were wrong on both counts. Kryn's 6 limbs began to tremble. His upper breathing chamber, the one that functioned when the filtration mask was working, fluttered like something trying to escape from inside his own body. "I have wealth," he said. His grav chair began to move backward, away from her, away from the slag. The magnetic suspension squealed slightly, another system failing, another piece of the Veshari infrastructure breaking down in real time. Planetary assets, a personal fleet of courier ships, still fueled, still operational. "I can offer you." "The refinery stopped producing 5 months ago," Raja said. She walked toward the viewport, her movements unhurried. "Your fleet runs on fumes. The fuel you think you have will sustain a journey of approximately 3 light-years before the reserves are exhausted. There are no safe ports within 3 light-years of Veshari space. Not anymore. Every refueling station in this sector has been closed or quietly transferred to Terran control. You have had no way to leave for over 100 rotations, and you did not even know it." She could see Kryn's reflection in the viewport glass, a creature slowly understanding the dimensions of the trap that had been constructed around him. 6 limbs, molting gray scales, the ceremonial talons that marked his rank, now reduced to 4 instead of the traditional 6. He had lost status in some internal power struggle years ago, before the Veshari's economy had fractured like old alloy under sudden stress. My security detail, Kryn tried again, but his voice had lost its force. He was beginning to understand that there was no negotiation possible here. There was only accounting. Paid, Raja said simply. For the last decade, every senior member of your protection detail has been receiving Terran currency routed through shell accounts on subsidiary colonies. Your chief of security transferred 14 terabytes of classified command protocols to our operatives 6 months ago. Your head of household took a 3 million credit bribe to ensure that your personal shuttle would remain grounded in the bay. They did not betray you out of ideology or coercion. They betrayed you because you taught them that everything has a price. She turned away from the viewport. In the darkness of the reflection, she could see her own face, a human face, with human proportions, wearing a human expression of absolute calm. The face of someone who had inherited a task 50 years ago and had been patient enough to complete it exactly on schedule. Before I read the final accounting, she said, I need you to understand something. This is not revenge. Revenge is personal. Revenge is emotional. Revenge is the province of creatures who cannot control their own biology, who cannot override the electrical impulses in their brains that scream for blood and vindication. This is something far more terrible. This is an audit. This is mathematics. This is the application of a consequence that was calculated and planned before you were even born. Your grandfather ordered the original bombardment of the Jakarta Spire. Your father inherited the crime and added 3 more bombardments to the tally. You inherited the debt. And now, after 50 years of patient work, the account comes due. She pulled a small device from her uniform, a slate, older model, scarred from 50 years of use in the field. The device bore the marks of 1,000 deployments, scorch marks from weapons fire, dents from falls, scratches from being dragged across rough surfaces in hostile environments. She had carried it with her through every step of the Veshari's slow economic collapse. The sabotaged supply lines, the redirected credits, the carefully orchestrated bankruptcies of their subsidiary colonies, one name at a time, one account at a time. No armies, no dramatic assault, just numbers. They expected a war, she said quietly, almost to herself. We gave them a foreclosure. Kryn made a sound, not words, not quite language. The filtration mask could not process the frequency of his own panic. His grav chair began to spin in slow circles, as if he could somehow escape from this conversation by moving through 3-dimensional space fast enough. I wish I could tell you it ended there. It didn't, because there was still one question left unanswered, the question that had driven every decision, every calculation, every moment of patience across 5 decades. Who was the one name that mattered? 50 years earlier. The evacuation shuttle's interior smelled of recycled air and electrical fires. Someone's console had sparked during the automated departure sequence, a small malfunction, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but enough to fill the cabin with an acrid chemical tang that made young Raja's eyes water. She was 7 years old. She was holding her mother's hand, and she was trying very hard not to cry, because her mother had explicitly told her that tears would cloud her thinking, and clear thinking was what would keep her alive in the next few minutes. The Veshari will strike in approximately 4 minutes, her mother said. Commander Nalakal was a deep-time auditor, which meant she had been trained to think in terms of consequence and patience and the long arc of cause and effect. She was not crying either. When they do, this platform will decompress. Everyone still aboard will be exposed to vacuum. The human body can survive approximately 90 seconds in hard vacuum before neural death becomes irreversible. Young Raja looked around the shuttle. There were 43 other humans aboard, scientists, engineers, maintenance personnel, a few children like herself. They all looked terrified. They all understood what was about to happen. Why do we leave them? Raja asked. She meant the thousands of people still on the Jakarta Spire, the ones who had been told to stay, to maintain the cover, to ensure that the Veshari would believe that the platform was truly a weapons facility and not a seed. Because, her mother said, some people must be invested in the outcome. The Veshari need to believe they have one. They need to feel the weight of what they have done. They need to look at what they have destroyed and feel the satisfaction of power applied absolutely. And then, when they are fat and certain, when they have convinced themselves that no human civilization could possibly threaten them. We will make them understand that nothing was free. Every action has a cost. Every empire built on blood will eventually be audited. The shuttle's departure sequence accelerated. Through the small viewport, young Raja could see the Jakarta spire receding, a massive platform of gleaming metal and crystalline structures, hanging in the void like a monument to human ambition. In exactly 3 minutes and 40 seconds, it would become a tomb. Will they hurt? Raja asked. Her mother did not answer for a long moment. Then, yes, but not for long. The vacuum will cause the blood to boil in their veins and the oxygen to escape from their lungs and the pressure in their bodies to equalize with nothing at all. It will take perhaps a minute. In that minute, they will understand that they are dying, and in that understanding, they will become part of the audit. They will become data. Young Raja absorbed this. Data, numbers, information that could be recorded and filed and used to calculate future consequences. Why do we do this? She asked. Because, her mother said, pressing a sealed data slate into Raja's small hands, someone has to remember. Someone has to keep the ledger. Someone has to ensure that the debt is paid, no matter how long it takes. And in your generation, or the generation after yours, or the generation after that, someone will read this slate and will understand what happened here. They will understand that the Jakarta spire was not a weapons facility. It was a seed, a sacrifice, a down payment on a debt that the Veshari will spend the rest of their civilization repaying. The shuttle's autopilot locked in the departure vector. Behind them, the Jakarta spire grew smaller and smaller against the background of stars. Raja's mother's hand grew colder in her grip. The old woman was dying. The stress of the evacuation, the weight of what she had just ordered, the burden of knowing that 47,000 people were about to cease existing because of a plan she had helped conceive. Her heart was failing, and she did not call for medical help. She simply held her daughter's hand and waited for the end. Promise me, her mother whispered, that you will finish this. Promise me that you will become the thing that hunts them. Promise me that you will be patient. Promise me that you will be merciless. I promise, young Raja said. Her mother died 43 seconds later, still holding the data slate in Raja's hands. The slate had been sealed in Raja's hands for 30 years. She did not open it. She did not study the data contained within its encrypted storage. She simply carried it, the way soldiers carry ammunition, the way priests carry holy relics, the way judges carry the weight of sentences they have already passed. For 3 decades, it had remained unopened, a promise she could not yet keep because she was not yet old enough to understand what her mother had asked of her. At age 17, she had applied to the Terran Reclamation Fleet. The interviewer, a woman named Kesso, whose left eye had been replaced with a cybernetic implant that could process threat patterns at light speed, had looked at Raja's file and asked a single question. Why do you want to join us? Raja had not mentioned the slate. She had not mentioned the Jakarta spire, or the 47,000 dead, or the evacuation shuttle, or her mother's hand growing cold against hers. Instead, she had said, I want to understand how systems fail. Kesso had smiled, a small, dangerous smile, and had accepted her into the program without further questions. For 13 years after that, Raja had learned. She had learned how economic systems could be weaponized. She had learned how to identify the pressure points in a civilization's infrastructure, not the military targets, but the supply chains, the fuel reserves, the trade agreements that held everything together. She had learned that the most devastating attack was not the one that destroyed your enemy, but the one that turned your enemy's own infrastructure into a weapon against them. And then, at age 30, the Reclamation Fleet had called her into a classified briefing and told her that the Veshari Dominion was still intact, still powerful, still ruled by the descendants of the creatures who had ordered the bombardment of the Jakarta spire. That was when she had finally opened the slate. Now, in Krin's command chamber, the slate was warm in her hands. She had carried it through every step of the penetration, through the automated defenses that had been bypassed using inverted Veshari access codes that her team had spent 8 years decrypting, through the manual breach of the airlock seal, through the elimination of 41 other operatives whose names were recorded in a file she did not allow herself to read anymore, because each name represented a choice she had made, a human life spent to advance the audit one step further. Your security detail took payment, she said to Krin. She did not look at him as she spoke. Instead, she scrolled through the personnel files on the slate, faces of Veshari administrators, each one flagged with a status indicator: active, compromised, deceased, relocated, for the last decade. But the payments began much earlier. Your chief of security was recruited 23 years ago, when he was still a junior officer in the Bombardment Fleet's Logistics Division. He did not even know he was being recruited. We simply bought the supply contracts he managed. We gradually redirected resources away from the Veshari military infrastructure and toward shell companies that we controlled. He thought he was making mistakes. He thought he was incompetent. In reality, he was being systematically dismantled. She turned the slate so Kryn could see the files. The data streamed across the display: names, dates, account numbers, amounts transferred, hundreds of millions in currency, routed through subsidiary colonies, military contractors, religious institutions, even a medical facility that provided organ transplants for aging Veshari nobility. Every thread of the Veshari economy had been infiltrated. Every major decision point had a human operative embedded within it, whispering suggestions, offering solutions, gradually steering the entire civilization toward a series of catastrophic choices that looked like accidents. The refinery director, Raja continued, was turned 41 years ago, before you were even born. We identified him as a child, brilliant mathematical mind, ambitious, willing to bend rules, and we spent decades cultivating him. His mother received a scholarship from a foundation we controlled. His sister's medical bills were paid by an insurance company we owned. His first business partner was one of our operatives, the one who taught him how to think about profit margins and quarterly returns instead of the long-term sustainability of civilization-level infrastructure. A micro cliffhanger emerged. How deep did the infiltration go? Kryn's breathing had become very shallow now. His filtration mask was struggling to keep pace with his panic response. The device was 60 years old, built during a time when the Veshari believed they had centuries of prosperity ahead of them, that their systems could be maintained indefinitely without major replacement cycles. 43 of your 112 senior administrators, Raja said. She did not need the slate to recite these numbers. She had memorized them years ago, the way a priest memorizes holy text. That is your penetration rate, 43 out of 112. The rest were simply starved of resources until they complied with policies that seemed reasonable, that seemed necessary, that seemed like the only logical choice given the available information. No one was tortured. No one was threatened with death. They were simply given incomplete data and asked to make decisions based on that data. And every decision they made was already calculated, already accounted for, already part of the larger design. She placed the slate on the desk beside the slag. The weight of it seemed to crush something in Kryn that was not his body, something deeper, something fundamental to his understanding of how the universe worked. When does it end? His voice had changed. The filtration mask made it sound like wind through a broken vent, like the last breath of a dying system. When does the accounting stop? When the debt is settled, Raja said. She did not answer the implied question. What is the price of settlement? Instead, she pulled up the next layer of data. The Jakarta Spire casualty list. 47,000 names. Not all of them, not yet, but the first 2,000 or so, displayed in a neat column on the slate, each with a birth date, a family tree, a genetic profile that made them uniquely themselves, each with an assigned value, not in currency, but in the precise biological and temporal cost of their erasure. She began to read them aloud. Yolanda Chen, born 2347, genetic profile, human baseline with minor cold adaptation modifications. Spouse, Marcus Chen. Children, 3. Occupation, hydroponics technician, lead shift supervisor. Estimated remaining lifespan if alive today, 41 years. Estimated offspring if alive today, 6 to 8 grandchildren. Genetic line, extinct. Kryn made a sound. Not words, not quite language. Kaya Conquo, born 2351. Genetic profile, human baseline with enhanced calcium density. Parents, deceased. Siblings, 2, both evacuated with the shuttle. Occupation, structural engineer, platform integrity division. Estimated remaining lifespan, 37 years. Estimated offspring, 4 to 6 children. Genetic line, extinct. She continued, 20 names, 50 names, 100 names. The list was not random. It was weighted by age, by genetic value, by potential offspring. It was the accounting of human potential that had been deleted from existence by a single bombardment sequence. A second micro cliffhanger crystallized. How many more names are on this list? Crin's grav chair made a sound like it was dying. The magnetic suspension was failing faster now, the chair tilting slightly. The elderly Veshari scrambling to maintain his balance on a platform that was becoming unstable. Some were children, Raja continued. Her voice remained level, mathematical, the voice of someone reading a balance sheet. The youngest was 4 months old. Her name was Imara Arkoro. She was a genetic experiment. Her parents were trying to breed out the vestigial gill slits that your species carries from your ocean-dwelling ancestors, the evolutionary remnants of a time when your people lived in water instead of air. She would have been the first of her family line born without them. She would have been a symbol of progress, of biological improvement, of the endless human drive toward optimization. Instead, she became data in an audit file, a line item, a genetic dead end. This was the emotional zoom, the moment when the scale collapsed into a single human detail. Not 47,000, one child, one 4-month-old infant, never given the chance to grow, never given the chance to prove that her genetic innovation was viable, never given the chance to do anything at all except cease existing. Crin's entire body had convulsed. For a moment, Raja thought he might attempt something desperate, a lunge at a hidden weapon, a desperate command to activate some final failsafe that might call for help, might somehow reverse the process of economic collapse that was unfolding in real time below them. But instead, he simply wept. Not with tears. Veshari did not produce tears. Their biological design considered them inefficient, but with a deep, shuddering collapse of his entire frame, as if his skeleton had decided it was too tired to hold him upright anymore. A third micro cliffhanger. Will he try to escape, or will he break entirely? Raja watched him dispassionately. She had been trained for this response. Every psychological profile, every behavioral prediction, every trauma response had been documented in her briefing files. The Veshari operated on hierarchical, transaction-based logic. The idea that something could not be purchased, could not be negotiated, could not be undone by sufficient payment. This was a concept that the Veshari mind simply could not process until the physical reality forced it into acceptance. There is a way to stop this, Crin said. It was not a question. It was a plea, a desperate grasp at a negotiating position that no longer existed. There is always a way to stop this. A price, a negotiation. Something I can give you that will. No, Raja said. The word fell into the chamber, like a stone, into deep water. There is no negotiation, she continued. There is no price. There is no offer you can make that will alter the course of what has already been calculated and set in motion. This is what separates human vengeance from Veshari vengeance, Crin. You believe that everything has a price. That power, status, wealth, the promise of future resources, that any of these things can be bartered away in exchange for survival. This is the fundamental flaw in your civilization. You have never encountered something that cannot be bought. You are about to encounter it now. She turned the slate toward him one final time. This time, she did not show him more names. Instead, she showed him the economic projection models, the mathematical calculations that had predicted, with 87% accuracy, the exact trajectory of the Veshari's economic collapse. The models showed the moment when the fuel supplies would run out. They showed the moment when the trade agreements would expire. They showed the moment when the subsidiary colonies would begin seceding from the Dominion, each one following the script that had been written for them years in advance. Your entire civilization has been playing a game where the rules were changed halfway through, Raja said. You were allowed to believe you were winning because the true cost of victory was being deferred, compounded, turned into interest that you would eventually have to pay. But the payment date is not negotiable. It is not flexible. It is not subject to discussion or counteroffer. It simply is. She placed her hand on the slag, the piece of metal that had been salvaged from the Jakarta spire before it was abandoned, before it was bombed into oblivion, before it was transformed from a symbol of human achievement into a symbol of human sacrifice. Now, she said, it is time to balance the accounts. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was the crushing weight of 50 years of accumulated interest coming due all at once. Kryn's hand moved first, not toward a weapon. There were no weapons left in the chamber. Raja had confirmed that before entering, had run the scan that showed every point of potential resistance, and had eliminated each one methodically. But toward the grav chair's emergency beacon, a small red sphere set into the armrest that had been installed when the chair was new, decades ago, back when the Veshari still believed that distance and hierarchy could protect them from consequence. His trembling fingers found it, and for one moment, a fraction of a second, that Raja's enhanced reflexes stretched into something approaching eternal. She thought he might actually try to call for help. She was faster, not by much. The subsonic round caught the beacon before his palm closed around it, and the sphere dissolved into inert slag, another small scrap of metal joining the debris of a dying empire. The round itself passed through the chair's armrest and embedded itself in the viewport's reinforced glass, leaving a small spiderweb of cracks that slowly began to spread outward from the impact point. "Your security detail is not coming," she said. This was not mercy. This was mathematics, the completion of a calculation that had been made years ago during the planning phase, when Raja's team had identified this exact moment and had accounted for his exact response. "They left 6 hours ago on your own private shuttle, the one you thought was locked in the bay. It was not locked. They had the codes. We gave them the codes. We wanted them to leave. We wanted you to be alone." Kryn's breathing became a series of small, broken gasps. His filtration mask could not keep pace with his panic response. The device was beginning to fail, a small electronic whine building in the background, like a machine reaching the end of its operational life. "They took everything," Raja continued. She was moving now, but not toward him, toward the viewport, the one with the spreading cracks where the subsonic round had embedded itself. She placed her palm against the reinforced glass. The material was warm from the friction of the round's passage. "Your personal accounts, your secured vaults, the genetic samples you were preserving in case the Dominion fell and you needed to rebuild from scratch, the cloning templates, the intelligence archives, the family records, all of it. They took it to Terra, where it will be studied, catalogued, analyzed for weaknesses, and then buried in a secure facility until the heat death of the universe. Your legacy, Kryn, your insurance policy, your last possible escape route, our insurance policy." She turned back to face him, and in the reflection of the viewport's cracked glass, she could see two figures, herself, standing with absolute stillness, and Kryn, a creature collapsing in slow motion, his 6 limbs unable to find purchase on a reality that was no longer solid beneath him. "There is one thing I need you to tell me," Raja said, "before we move to the final accounting, before we reach the moment where this ends in the only way it can end. One name, a single name from the command structure of the bombardment fleet, the pilot who activated the payload sequence, the one who actually pressed the button, the one whose hands released the missiles that fell on the Jakarta spire and made it a tomb." Kryn's upper body convulsed, not from emotion, from something deeper, something biological, the rejection response of his own body to what she was asking, as if his physiology itself understood that answering this question would complete the circuit of his guilt, would eliminate the last possible compartmentalization between himself and the crime. "I cannot," he whispered. His filtration mask wheezed like a dying animal. The electronic whine had grown louder now, more insistent. "That information is protected. The pilot's identity was sealed by the War Council. The records were classified beyond even my access level. Even I do not." "You know," Raja said simply. She was reading from the slate again, the device displaying data that Kryn had never seen before, data that his own security system had not even known existed. "The files confirm it. Your personal logs, Kryn. The ones you kept sealed behind triple encryption, the ones you thought were your final secret. You reviewed the bombardment sequence personally, 7 times in the first year after the attack. You saw the name. You read the operational orders. You knew who pulled the trigger, and you chose not to acknowledge it. That is a different kind of guilt, is it not? Not the guilt of ordering the attack, but the guilt of knowing who executed it and saying nothing." Kryn's head dropped. His scales had begun to lose their color, the gray tone fading into something closer to white, as if fear itself was draining the pigmentation from his body. Raja waited. She had learned patience 50 years ago in the evacuation shuttle, holding her mother's slate while the woman's body went cold against hers. Patience was not a virtue in human culture. It was a weapon. and she had learned to wield it with the precision of someone who had spent her entire existence training for this specific moment. "My brother," Kryn said finally. The words came like blood from a wound. "Keln. My brother led the bombardment squadron. He was the wing commander. He was the one who calculated the strike pattern. He was the one who selected the targets. Keln was the one who—" He could not finish. His breathing had become so shallow that Raja could barely detect the rise and fall of his chest. Keln was the one who understood that the Jakarta spire housed civilians, Raja said. She was not asking. She was stating fact, data extracted from intelligence reports that had been compiled decades before this moment. He knew. The preliminary scans showed the signatures of human children. He saw the data, and he ordered the bombardment anyway, because he believed the platform was a weapons facility, because he believed that the potential military advantage outweighed the confirmed civilian casualties, because he was Veshari, and Veshari do not question orders from above. They execute them, and then they file reports and move on to the next assignment. She withdrew a small data chip from her uniform, old model, scarred like the slate. She placed it carefully on the desk beside the slag, positioning it so the light from Kryn's failing grav chair caught its surface and cast small shadows across the polished alloy. "Keln died," she said. 43 years ago, traffic accident on Veshari Prime, ground transport malfunction. The brake lines corroded simultaneously, a mechanical failure that should have been statistically impossible given the maintenance protocols. It was very quick. One moment he was processing a report on the latest fuel shipment from the refinery division. The next moment, the transport was falling from the transport tube, and his body was being recovered from the impact zone in 3 separate pieces. His family was told it was bad luck, a terrible, random accident, a tragedy that could not have been prevented. She watched Kryn's reaction carefully, the subtle shift in his scales, the way his breathing pattern changed when she mentioned the corrosion of the brake lines, the realization beginning to dawn. It was not a malfunction, Raja continued. She was reading from another file now, one that contained details about a human operative who had spent 2 years embedded in the Veshari maintenance division. It was a precision strike. The brake lines were cut by a human operative whose identity remains classified even in our own records. Keln never saw it coming. He died thinking it was bad luck. He died thinking the universe was random and uncaring. He died without ever knowing that his death was payment for his actions. That is the cruelty we chose to execute, Kryn, not to make him suffer with knowledge, but to let him die without it, to let him think his life meant nothing at all, to reduce a creature who believed he had wielded absolute power down to the status of a random statistic, a victim of circumstance, a name in a list of accidents that no one would ever investigate. A micro cliffhanger crystallized. How many others died the same way? Kryn's grav chair made a sound, a mechanical groan, as if the device itself was experiencing physical pain. The magnetic suspension was beginning to fail, the chair tilting incrementally, the elderly Veshari forced to grip the armrests to keep from sliding sideways. "Every officer in the bombardment chain," Raja said. "Except you. We wanted you to survive. We needed you to know. We needed you to understand that everyone else paid the price while you climbed higher, accumulated more wealth, convinced yourself that distance and power meant safety. Your wing commander, dead in what appeared to be an accident. Your fleet admiral, suicide, though it was not suicide. Your logistics coordinator, mysterious illness, caught from contaminated water, though the water was contaminated on purpose. One by one, the chain of command that gave the order to bombard the Jakarta spire was eliminated, each death appearing natural, each death attributable to chance or circumstance or simple human bad luck. She moved toward the viewport again, looking out at the darkness below. Veshari Prime was visible from this height, a planet that had once glowed with civilization and now appeared almost completely dark, not because the power had been cut, it had in most sectors, but because the people had stopped bothering to maintain the lights. They had begun to understand, at some level below conscious thought, that the game was already over, that the Dominion was already dead, that they were simply living in the corpse of an empire that had spent 50 years rotting from the inside, while appearing whole from the outside. "This is the part that still keeps me awake at night," Raja said. It was not a line from her briefing. It was not in any of the files. It was something she was choosing to say in this moment to this broken figure in a failing grav chair. Your brother did not die knowing what he had done. He died thinking it was random, bad luck, a universe that did not care about his choices or his actions or his existence. That is the cruelty we chose, not to make him suffer with Nala, but to let him die without it, to let him think his life meant nothing at all. And I have spent 43 years wondering if that was the right choice, if it was cruel enough, if the punishment matched the crime. She placed her hand on the slate, on the data chip, on the slag. 3 objects arranged in a line on Crin's desk, each one representing a different layer of the audit. The account is not settled by your death alone, Raja said. It is settled by the knowledge that you will die knowing that every certainty you held was built on sand. Every power you wielded was already corrupted. Every family member you loved was already targeted. And the worst part, the part that will follow you into whatever comes after death, is knowing that none of it was dramatic, none of it was glorious. It was simply administration, accounting, the slow, patient application of consequence to a creature who believed himself immune to it. A second micro cliffhanger. What will happen to the other Veshari? Is this extinction deliberate? She withdrew the sidearm, the one she had shown him earlier, the gesture that had closed negotiation. She did not raise it. She simply held it, letting the weight of it settle in the chamber between them. The weapon was old, a ceremonial model favored by Veshari security forces for its compact grace and its terrible efficiency. She had found it in Crin's desk drawer, exactly where the intelligence reports had predicted it would be. I want you to understand something about human vengeance, she continued. She was walking now, slowly, toward the grav chair. Not rushing, never rushing. The way death itself moved, inexorable, patient, inevitable. It is not rage. It is not passion. It is not the hot, blinding emotion that your species associates with revenge. It is mathematics applied with infinite patience. It is the audit that never ends. It is the understanding that some debts take generations to collect, and that the payment is made not in blood or tears or suffering, but in the systematic dismantling of everything that a creature believes themselves to be. She was close enough now to see the individual scales on his neck, each one trembling in a slightly different rhythm. The grav chair's power core was failing. She could hear the capacitors struggling, the magnetic suspension losing coherence by fractions of a second. In approximately 90 seconds, the device would die entirely. Crin would fall. Your brother thought about food, Raja said quietly. This was not in the files. This was something she had learned from the preliminary scan data of the transport before it was destroyed, a moment of mundane human consciousness preserved in the vehicle's recorder. In the last 3 seconds before the brake lines failed, Kelm was reading a report about the refinery fuel shipment, but his mind had already moved on. He was thinking about food. He was thinking about the meal he wanted to eat at the next station. He was thinking about a Veshari delicacy, the preserved organs of the creatures that lived in the deep oceans of your homeworld. He was thinking about hunger, the most human of all concerns. And then the transport failed, and he died with that thought in his head. Not thoughts of war, not thoughts of his victims, just hunger, just the mundane desire to eat something that would taste good. Crin made a sound, not words, not quite language. The sound of a creature understanding, for the first time, the full scope of what had been done to him and his family and his entire civilization. That is what your brother's last thought was, Raja repeated. Hunger, and we let him die with that. We thought it was cruel, we thought it was perfect. She raised the sidearm. She raised the sidearm. The weapon came up smoothly, the barrel crossing the space between them in a fraction of a second. Crin's 6 limbs made one final convulsive movement, not toward escape, not toward defense, a reflex, an ancient neural pattern that his body was executing even as his mind had already surrendered. The first shot was subsonic. It passed through the upper chamber of his filtration mask with the precision of a surgeon's cut. The mask fractured. The hermetic seal broke. The chemical stasis medium that the Veshari required to breathe the oxygen-rich atmosphere of their own planet began to escape into the stale air of the chamber. Crin's breathing became a series of dry, choking gasps. His lungs were burning, not from the exertion, but from the understanding that Raja was not going to make this quick. This was not mercy. This was the final lesson. The second shot caught the armrest of the grav chair. The magnetic suspension, already failing, already barely coherent, collapsed entirely. The chair dropped. Kryn fell, his 6 limbs flailing for purchase on empty air, finding nothing but the polished alloy floor rushing up to meet him. He hit hard, not hard enough to break bones. Raja had calculated the fall distance carefully, had run the impact scenarios. Hard enough to hurt, hard enough to break the last remaining dignity. She did not fire again. She simply stood, watching, as Kryn struggled to his elbows, his filtration mask now little more than a broken shell hanging from what remained of his face. His chest heaved, his gills, vestigial, barely functional, evolutionary remnants from a time when his species had lived in water, began to flutter in panic, attempting to process an atmosphere his biology was not equipped to survive for long. "The genetic samples your security detail stole," Raja said. Her voice was level, conversational. "The ones you thought you had hidden, we found them, we studied them, and we discovered something interesting about Veshari biology. Your entire species carries dormant vulnerabilities, genetic weaknesses that you have been selectively breeding away from for 10,000 years. But they are still there, still encoded in your DNA, still waiting." Kryn's eyes widened, not understanding yet, but beginning to. "Terra has the complete Veshari genetic code," she continued. She was reading from the slate again, though she did not look down at it. The words were engraved in her memory, burned there by years of rehearsal. "We know every weakness, every pressure point, every mutation that your species considers defective. And we have decided, as a civilization, that the Veshari Dominion does not require military intervention to end. It requires time. It requires patience. It requires a single viable plan, implemented by human operatives embedded in your medical facilities, your breeding programs, your genetic counseling centers, all already in place, all already activated. By the time your civilization realizes what is happening, it will be too late. Your children will begin to be born with the very vulnerabilities you spent millennia trying to eliminate. Your population will begin to fail. Your genetics will become unreliable. And in 3 generations, approximately 75 years, the last viable Veshari will draw their last breath. Not from conquest, from mathematics, from the slow, inexorable application of biological consequence." Kryn's mouth opened. Not words, just a sound. The sound of something understanding that the revenge had never been about him, had never been about violence or rage or any of the emotions his species associated with vengeance. It had always been about this. The cold certainty that you had been beaten not just militarily, not just economically, but at the level of your own species' fundamental code, that you had been turned into an equation, that your entire civilization had been reduced to a calculation. Raja lowered the sidearm. "But you will not see it," she said quietly. "You will not live to watch your species end. And that is a mercy, Kryn, a small one, but a mercy nonetheless." She placed the barrel against the back of his neck. Not the head. She had learned over 50 years of planning that the head was not reliable. The spine was. The spine was always reliable. Kryn's breathing had become very shallow now. The broken filtration mask was doing almost nothing. His gills were barely functioning. He was drowning in his own atmosphere, suffocating in the air that he had believed, for his entire life, was his birthright. "My mother promised me something," Raja said. 50 years ago, in an evacuation shuttle with 43,000 other humans. She made me promise that I would finish this, that I would become the thing that hunts you, that I would be patient, that I would be merciless. And I have kept that promise, every day, every decision, every moment of patience across 50 years. I have kept it." She pulled the trigger. The sound was not loud. Subsonic weapons were designed for silence, for discretion, for the kind of work that left no acoustic signature, no evidence, no trace of violence beyond the body. The round passed through Kryn's spinal cord with perfect precision. His entire body went rigid, then slack. He collapsed forward onto the polished alloy floor, his 6 limbs sprawling at angles that would have been impossible for anything still alive. Raja did not look at the body. She simply turned toward the viewport, toward the dark expanse of Veshari Prime below, and began to transmit. The code was simple, 7 digits, a sequence that had been prepared years in advance, encrypted with keys that existed only in her slate, and in a secure facility 3 light-years away on Terra. "Audit complete." The message went out on a tight beam transmission, encoded in a frequency that the Veshari had never learned to monitor. It crossed the darkness between the zenith spire and the iron ledger in the time it took for light to travel 3 kilometers. And in that moment, somewhere in the void above, the cloaked human vessel received the signal and began its own transmission back to Terra. 50 years of patience, 50 years of planning, 50 years of watching an enemy civilization slowly strangle itself on the very infrastructure that they believed made them strong. Finished. Raja placed the sidearm on the desk beside the slag. The 3 objects arranged in a line now. The slate, the data chip, the weapon, 3 layers of evidence, 3 artifacts of an audit that would never be fully known outside the Terran reclamation fleet. She did not move for a long moment. She simply stood in the center of Kryn's command chamber, looking out at a planet that was now beginning its final descent. The power grids would fail completely within hours. The water recirculation would stop. The atmosphere processing would wind down to nothing. The Veshari Prime would cool slowly into a tomb. And the survivors on the surface, there were approximately 11 billion of them, according to the latest scans, would begin to understand that their civilization was not at war. It was collapsing. It was decomposing. It was being audited down to the last surviving cell. She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew something that had not left her body in 30 years. The data slate that her mother had placed in her hands, in that evacuation shuttle, while the Jakarta spire receded behind them against the background of stars. It was still sealed, still encrypted, still containing whatever data her mother had deemed important enough to pass down through a lifetime. Raja looked at it for a long moment. Then she placed it on the desk beside the slag, and she opened it. The files cascaded across the display, not data as she had expected, but a message, text, encoded in her mother's own handwriting, preserved in the slate's quantum storage for exactly this moment. "My daughter," the message began, "if you are reading this, then the account is settled, the debt is paid, and you have become the thing I asked you to become, the hunter, the auditor, the keeper of consequences." Raja did not read further. She did not need to. She already knew what her mother would have written, already knew the weight of it, already knew that the moment she had spent 50 years preparing for was not an ending. It was a beginning, the beginning of understanding what it meant to carry that slate, what it meant to be the instrument of a civilization's slow decline, what it meant to look at a species and know, with mathematical certainty, that you had calculated the precise moment and manner of their extinction. She closed the slate. She placed it back in her pocket, next to her heart, where it had rested for 30 years. Then she turned toward the archive door, the one she had blown open to enter this chamber, the one that still hung from its twisted hinges, and she began to walk, not slowly, not quickly, simply at the pace of someone who had finished a task and was now moving on to the next one. Behind her, in the command chamber, the viewport continued to frost with cracks from the subsonic round. The slag remained on the desk, scratched and marked and transformed by the weight of what it had witnessed. And Fleet Lord Kryn remained on the floor, his 6 limbs arranged in the final position of surrender, his scales already beginning to lose their color, his body already beginning its transition from living matter to data, to statistics, to a line in the final audit report that would be filed in a Terran database and never read again. The iron ledger was waiting, 3 kilometers above. Raja did not check her weapon, did not examine her hands for blood. There was none. Did not pause to verify that Kryn was actually dead. He was. Mathematics did not lie, and she had spent 50 years learning to trust mathematics more than breath. She moved through the corridors of the Zenith processing spire in silence. The facility was completely dead now. No hum of life support, no whisper of air recirculation, no electronic pulse of a civilization still maintaining the pretense of existence. Just the sound of her footsteps on metal floors. Just the sound of an auditor moving through the corpse of an empire. When she reached the docking bay, the iron ledger was already powering up the docking clamps. The airlock was already cycling open. The ship itself was already running the calculations that would get them back across Veshari space and into the deep void where human warships waited to escort them home. Raja entered the airlock and sealed it behind her. She did not look back at the Zenith processing spire, did not take a final photograph or record a final timestamp. The spire was already behind her, already part of the audit, already complete. The iron ledger's interior was exactly as she had left it, cold, minimal, the kind of vessel that was designed for hunters, not explorers, for instruments, not passengers. She moved directly to the captain's station and entered the final transmission code. Audit complete. Debt settled. VSHARI Dominion Terminal, returning to Terra for debrief. The message went out across the darkness, and somewhere in the depths of Terran space, in command centers and intelligence facilities and classified military installations, the confirmation began to arrive. 50 years, one hunter, one species, one civilization reduced to mathematics and consequence. Complete. Raja settled into the command chair of the Iron Ledger. The ship's engines began to spin up, the magnetic suspension reaching full coherence, the navigation systems locking onto the vector that would carry them back home. She removed the slate from her pocket one final time and placed it on the console in front of her. It was no longer sealed. The data was no longer encrypted. It was just a piece of old technology, scarred from 50 years of use, containing nothing but her mother's words and her own promise, finally kept. The Iron Ledger disengaged from the Zenith processing spire and began to rise. Veshari Prime fell away below, a planet full of light and life and civilization. All of it already doomed, all of it already calculated, all of it already paid for with the blood and memory of 47,000 humans who had been transformed from flesh into data 50 years before. In the darkness of the void, a human ship rose toward the stars, and in the command chamber of the Zenith processing spire, the slag remained on the desk, scratched and marked and transformed into something it had never been before, proof that vengeance could be executed as accounting, that patience could be weaponized, that a civilization's greatest strength, their belief in the price of everything, could be turned into their final, inescapable weakness. The lights of Veshari Prime continued to dim.